Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of No One's a Critic. I'm Kino, joined as always by Mac. And I just have to point out before we get started, I see you have a Taylor Swift The Eras Tour cup right there with you.
Yes, it's my wife's.
Did
It
you
is
go?
not
Did,
mine.
did you or she go to it?
Oh wait, no. I'm sorry. No, she didn't go. You're right. She saw when it was in theaters, and they did it like in movie theaters.
Yeah. The movie version of the tour. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So she did because it did come to Chicago. One of the Era Tour shows was in Chicago. But no, she saw it at the theater, and I don't actually think she got it when she went. They were sold out. I think. I think we went to a movie like oh no, sorry, my apologies, we went to the movies like a week before she was seeing it, and she bought one while she was there because she's like, I don't want to wait a week because they're going to be sold out. Yeah, so she bought it. And she gets pissed because I use it a lot because it's like really big, and so I use it for water. And she's like, are you using my Taylor Swift? I'm like, yeah.
I was gonna be like, if she actually went to the concert, it's like, damn, you guys got some money because that shit is expensive as fuck. It's
Oh
like
god,
10
no.
grand a ticket for like minimum.
No, she loves concerts, but I think that's a little bit too much. That's like, I almost like, I feel like if I spent like 10 grand, I mean, granted, it depends on like what your income level is, but like even that, so like, I feel like I would feel guilty and like I wouldn't even be having fun. I'd be like, this sucks.
I went to Black Sabbath's last like tour ever called The End, and we got like VIP seats, and the tickets were like $350, and we
that's
got to
not,
go in front
that's
of
not
the
even
line.
bad.
We were there. It was awesome, but like 10 grand? Are you fucking kidding me? That shit's crazy.
350. That's not even bad. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
no, it was awesome. I love that tour. I love Black Sabbath.
Nice.
Um, did she like the Tortured Poet Society album?
I think so. I didn't really ask her about it. I think she's kind of like she's not like a psycho Swifty, like those people, where it's like if you say one bad thing about her, we'll literally dox you. Um, but I don't know. I think she did. She probably had like mixed or because I kind of heard that was sort of what people were saying. Like it was like good, but like kind of like was like mixed. I guess it was sort of like she was retreading old ground.
Yeah, my wife really likes Taylor Swift, but only her early stuff. She doesn't really like modern Taylor Swift. And we listened to that album, and I was kind of disappointed because I was like, given the title and given where she's at, I was like, oh, maybe this is the album where she actually kind of like lets loose and it's like, she's already a billionaire. Like she's at the height of what she could possibly achieve. Like now is the time to take a little bit more risks. But it's just a normal like Taylor Swift album. It's kind of disappointing to be honest.
Yeah, I do appreciate that she kind of went from like country to like pop country to straight up pop to sort of like then she kind of moved into more like soft rock, like with like her woodsy albums. I don't know what the term is. Um but yeah, now it kind of seems like she's got to like, now you got to find a new direction. You got to do something new.
I worry about her, and this is not a Taylor Swift episode, by the way, but I worry
Why
about her
not? No kidding.
uh, because she is at a level of success that is so like unimaginable. Like no one is at her level. Like Beyonce is not on her level. Like the amount of money and the stardom that she has is so high that like I fear the only direction she has to go is down. And I'm worried that if she goes down for some reason, like something bad happens or whatever, like she, I don't know, gets canceled or does makes a mistake or something where it's going to be like a fall from grace that we've never seen before. Like we've seen like Britney Spears or whatever, like these celebrities like crash and burn their lives out, and
Oh, I see.
it doesn't look like Taylor Swift would do that right now, but like I don't know, just being at that level must like drive people crazy, and I'm the next 10 years or so of her career would be very interesting to see if she ended up crashing and burning.
Well, that's what's sort of like weird with like, what was I forget what it was, but it was sort of like the question of like what happens when if you're a, doesn't, you don't have to be a singer, you don't have to be, you can be athletics, whatever. What happens when you like reach like the highest level? Like what do you do? Like you almost feel like, granted, like it's almost like for us, like with like YouTube, where it's almost like I can imagine, like I don't mean to say this of like I probably like this is probably like super ignorant of me, but like I imagine like getting to like 1 million subscribers, like that'd be cool. But also, it's kind of like okay, like I'd almost be like, okay, that's kind of what I was. That's cool, but I'm like, what I feel even it's almost like diminishing returns where 1,000 subs is cool, 10,000 is awesome, like 100,000, yeah, and then it's like, okay, oh, it's like it's still cool, but it's like it definitely feels like diminishing returns after a while.
Yeah, I'm approaching 100,000. I'm at 90 something and change right now, and I'm really looking forward to that. That's like been my goal for a long time. But after that, I'm not even gonna like track it at all, just because
Yeah,
I know like you kind of know your audience and stuff, and you know their level of reach that you have. And I'll never hit the next milestone, which is 1 million. Like my type of content, like the video essay analysis stuff, it just doesn't appeal to that many people, unless you do something like Nerdstalgic or whatever, where you're making a bunch of different videos on a bunch of different topics. But that's never been my kind of focus. I like kind of doing deep dives into a few stuff rather than having the broad mass appeal.
yeah. Eventually, it's sort of it's again diminishing where it's like the more popular you want to be, the more you kind of have to. I don't want to say dilute your content. That's not the right word. And that's not the case in every case, but it does seem like in general, the people who don't fall into that are sort of like the outliers.
Like getting to that really high level takes so much like strategy and stuff. It's sometimes you get there naturally just from like charisma, or you really make really good content or whatever. But for a lot of people, it's like you got to kind of game the system, and that's just not fun at all.
Yeah.
But anyway, enough of this bullshit. We were going to talk about a show.
Believe it or not, yeah, this episode has nothing to do with YouTube analytics and or Taylor Swift's career, but
Well, we
good
usually have like
intro.
an intro. We talk about some random shit. I saw. I mean, before we move on to that, I mean, congratulations on finishing your Hannibal video. I
Oh,
know
thank
that took
God,
a long
yeah.
time. Yeah.
Barry's next. I think I'm gonna be able to get this one out because it's a much shorter show. It's only 16. It's like in total like 16 hours long. It's really basically like a season of television, really. So, um, and I think I have a good. I really enjoyed it when it ran. So, have you seen Barry?
I saw the first season. It was okay, but I didn't really want to keep watching it after that.
I'd say if you ever do revisit, try season one is sort of it's an interesting show where so season one was I think good. It was a good start. Season two was sort of like perfecting the formula of season one. Like it's like almost like season one, but like done it's like perfected. It finally found like its balance. Like season one's kind of uneven. It's still good, but it's uneven in the sense that like tonally it's a very tonally strange show. It's like a comedy hitman, yeah. Um but then what was interesting was that so the gap between season 2 and 3 was like 3 or 4 years due to COVID. Um and when the show came back, it was like it became a completely different show in like a good way. I think the show really like there's something to be said about, you know, um I do think like there are certain circumstances where like if you wait too long between seasons, the magic is gone. So like I think of like Curb Your Enthusiasm or Arrested Development. Like it wasn't bad, like the revivals, but like they just it's okay. It's kind of the moment's passed. Barry was interesting where I think the writers really it gave them time to kind of look at what the show was trying to be or where it was going and really turned it around where it's probably one of the most original shows I've ever seen. Um, yeah, very good. If that instills in you to maybe give it a watch sometime. And luckily it's only 8 episodes per season, half-hour episodes, so it's not too much of an investment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Um, but we are here to
But
talk about another show that did not have a gap between long gap between seasons, but also had some maybe lost focus towards the end as well. House of Cards. We're going to talk about that show this episode. Mac wanted to talk about it. What I really liked House of Cards when it first came out. Like it was one of Netflix's like real breakout shows when they were first getting started. You had that, you had Narcos, you had Orange Is the New Black. Like they came out with some very like hit shows out of the gate with their original programming. And House of Cards was obviously a very popular show for a while.
I'd almost attribute House of Cards to sort of like the beginning of the another sort of, because I almost wonder. I think, it's funny, we were talking about it a couple episodes ago. People think of the original, the second, well, it's technically known as like the second golden age of television, but like for us in our generation, probably the first would be uh the introduction of premium channels, shows like Sopranos, The Wire, et cetera, et cetera. The second would be probably later down the line with like Mad Men and Breaking Bad, about 10 years later. I actually think House of Cards may have been the precursor to sort of like another like mini renaissance.
I would say so, like the streaming golden age, like you could almost
Yes.
call it like that. Yeah, there was.
Before it was super oversaturated. It was actually like, yes.
Yeah, I agree. Like this, there was a time when Netflix's original like programming was
It was the
looked upon
shit, bro.
very favorably.
Yeah.
I mean, arguably it still is to an extent. Like people do pay attention, but they definitely like people have gotten wise to the Netflix formula, which is hook you in with like a very interesting season one, but have nowhere to go after that. Now, I actually don't think House of Cards follows that because I think House of Cards stays pretty interesting for a while, not the entire run. But it had stuff to go on, beyond the first season. Now we should, of course, mention that it is based. It's an adaptation of the British series of the same name, sort of similar to The Office, where I probably the American version is the more famous one now than the original British version.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because around that time, after sort of House of Cards came around and Orange Is the Black, True Detective was, I think, that very next year, and that was sort of, I think House of Cards actually predated it as if sort of like the first big. I remember, at least for me, and that's not. This isn't to say that like there weren't other shows that did this, but I remember that when the episodes came out on Netflix, each episode was chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. That was, I think, it sort of like tried to instill in the viewer of like, this is it's more of like a novelistic approach where we're trying to get back into that sort of like hyper serialized, you know uh visual novel-esque feel to it. However, I will. What's kind of funny about the legacy of House of Cards is that while I think it definitely was influential in kicking off that sort of second or third, whatever, new mini renaissance, whatever. A lot of people obviously will bring up Kevin Spacey's, him getting Me Too, that sort of threw a wrench in the show. However, I will argue that I actually think the show kind of stopped being good around like season 3, and it kind of lost its way before. A lot of people sort of blame that's kind of like the irony is a lot of people sort of like blame the whole Kevin's, regardless of what side you are on that. It A lot of people like will cite that as sort of like that's why it became bad. It's like, no, I think it was kind of bad before that. I think the show kind of lost it because it had it was set up as sort of like Netflix's big flagship show. It was a show that went on way too long and they had to keep milking it, and it just kind of lost its way at some point.
It reminds me a lot of Game of Thrones, where like a lot of people like all they'll talk about is like season 8, the horrible final season. Whereas for
Exactly.
me, the show had been going downhill since about midway, and I agree with you. Season 3 was arguably the last season that I thought was like really really good. Season 4 and 5 had season 4 in particular. I actually think was pretty good too. Season 5 was like, okay, this is like about 50% good, 50% bad, and for me that's not a good sign.
No.
But again, people only ever talk about the last season 6 when they wrote out the main character because of Kevin Spacey's allegations, which we should acknowledge were later thrown out of court. So, I mean, I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to to talk about Kevin Spacey, like people have been openly talking about how kind of creepy and weird he is for a long
Yeah.
time. I mean, I don't know if it's justified him getting written out of the show or not, but it's yeah, he's a weird guy.
Yeah, I'm cool with it. I don't really, from everything I've read on him, there seems to be a pretty clear pattern there. It wasn't like it wasn't one of those things where it was just like, oh, this one time. It's like, no, this kind of felt like it was an open seek, very similar to like Cosby or Weinstein. Um,
It was though the nail in the coffin. Like I didn't watch season
yes,
6 because, and it's not even that I was like so in love with Kevin Spacey, which I mean I love his acting. I think he's a fantastic actor. He's phenomenal. Like I can separate a person's life from their work, and I can still appreciate his incredible acting to this day. But yeah, writing out the lead character who the show was entirely based around, and yes, they had been really building up Robin Wright's character, but to do that final season without him, I can. A lot of people just tuned out, including myself. I was just like, "There's no way they're gonna land this." And I've watched some clips here and there of the sixth season, and I kind of feel justified in my decision that like,
oh
yeah,
yeah, no,
this show is way off the rails, you know, before all this shit went down, and it's not gonna pick up steam at the end here.
yeah. I mean, again, it's like everyone, and that was sort of the shame where it was like people were like, um, I do think people sort of like blamed like, oh, well, it was woke because they had Claire take over, and it's like that. I mean, like, well, one, like season 5 set that up anyway. It did kind of feel like had Spacey stayed on the show, season 6 would have been the final season. I mean, maybe, but it kind of felt like that with like spoilers, although I wouldn't bother with it. But basically, and so, well, actually, here, let me start back because I think I want to like outline as to why I think the show went wrong. So, season 1, you have Kevin Spacey. He is the House Majority Whip of the White House. Um, and he is promised Secretary of State to climb the ladder. He gets fucked over by the president, and then he begins this big, long revenge scheme in order to attain the presidency for himself. The end of season 1 ends with him attaining vice presidency, which I think was okay. That makes sense where he's making progress, but he's not there yet. But then something weird happened where at the end of season 2, he becomes president, which I think that's not like technically a bad thing. However, the sense that a lot of people got from the show, and again, this was sort of back before, True Detective, and we like I'm for like a show that like, hey, 3 seasons and we're good. But I think a lot of people did sort of feel like, oh, I was kind of expecting this show to go on for like 5 or 6 seasons, and he's already attained president by season 2. It's like, okay. And then season 3 is him dealing with all the bullshit, and season 3 ends with Claire like sort of realizing, you know, their dynamic and how it's not good, and how she's always going to be second fiddle to him. And then it ends with her leaving him, which is a perfect setup for, I would presume, Frank's downfall. Claire will set out to defeat him, and that will lead to his downfall. But then at the end of season 4, they like get back together. And then at the end of season 5, they break up, but Claire's in charge. And it's like, for me, I think, to your point, I do think there were a lot of issues with season 3, but I think it ended like at a pretty logical, like it ended at a pretty logical, consistent like story beat. Season 4 is where I kind of like, what are we doing? Like, you're setting up Frank versus Claire, and then they get back together at the end of season 4. And it's like, and that kind of felt to me, that was the moment where they're like, okay, we need to milk this shit for several more seasons.
Yeah, and I think there is some like logic to it. Like, I mean, not to get into politics, but this is a political show. But like, it's heavily meant to be a lot like Bill and Hillary Clinton, right? There's like this kind of uh, the wife taking over for the husband thing, and as crazy as the idea of a husband and wife, president and vice president, has actually happened in history too. Argentina,
Really?
yeah, yeah, the power couple. I'll throw up. I'll just throw up I'll look it up later. I'll throw up a image or whatever. But it's happened before in like some like South American countries, like a husband and wife, president vice president duo.
Cool.
So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that something like that happened. And again, it's meant to kind of be reflecting some real life political stuff. So does it kind of stretch the imagination a little bit? Sure, but I can kind of get what they were going for. Um, I just I mean, I wonder what their season 6 would have looked like if Kevin Spacey had not gotten those allegations. Like they were building up to something, but the problem, especially with season 6, was that they're just like, oh, Frank's dead. Yeah, no, he's just not around anymore, and we're just gonna keep going, and we're not gonna talk about him anymore. And it's just so weird for a show that heavily revolved around him. And yes, again, obviously they're building up Claire and building up her role. um, but yeah, it just it's like, I mean, imagine the final season of The Sopranos. Tony died of a heart attack before the season started, and it's about Carmela. Like, could you make that interesting story? Maybe, but like for a lot of fans, they would just be like, "What the fuck? Like, this is
Well, at
an
least with
integral part of the show."
yeah, at least with the Sopranos, like you'd have a bunch of other characters who were developed, and you could do stuff. Whereas like House of Cards was like mostly focused on them. So that was a big thing. Um, but yeah, the issue for, well, one, I need to get this off my chest because I always bitch about it. So I when I look at the show, I'm like, okay, at the end of season 3, Claire leaves Frank. So I would presume that season 4 would be like Frank's downfall. Claire would like work with reporters or other people. He's been president for 2 seasons or 1 season, and this is the 2nd season, and this will be his downfall. I think that's like a logical structure of the show. And that would result in each season is 13 episodes, which means that with 4 seasons, there would be 52 episodes, as there are 52 cards in a deck. And they didn't do that. And it's gonna drop. That nothing has, that like, I even thinking about it upsets me. Like, why didn't you do that, you motherfucker?
That actually, yeah, you're right. That would have been
Oh, that would have been so sick. Like, come on, guys. It makes perfect sense. The structure. Oh,
obviously from a Netflix revenue perspective. The cuteness of having that be thematically probably doesn't outweigh the fact that I'm sure they made money off of season 4, 5, and 6, and
of
so
course. The people still tuned in for the shit
I
show.
mean the BBC miniseries that it was based on was only I mean 4 episodes, which you could argue that maybe like each episode would represent one season because it's a miniseries, so 4 would be good too. But yeah, it's and it does end it does end with his downfall, the Francis character of that series. I've not watched it, but I've kind of read a little bit about it. um I think they play up more of the reporter girl character in the British one. I will say season 2 episode 1, the ending of that episode is one of the most like one of the best moments of television I've ever seen, because they subvert this thing where you're like, oh, okay, it's gonna be Frank versus whatever the reporter girl's name was. I can't
Zoe.
remember it. Zoe. And they're setting up. They're like, oh, she's gonna question it. She's gonna pull threads, and she's gonna realize about this murder, and he just kills her. And it's so shocking. And normally I don't like shocking, like subversive stuff like that, but I think they did it really well, especially because you don't hear him talking to the camera throughout the entire episode. He does this thing in the series where he narrates to the camera. It's like a gimmick the show has, and he doesn't do it at all that episode. And after the murder, right as the episode ends, he starts to talk
That
to the
was sick.
camera,
Oh,
and
you're
it's
still
very
here? Yeah.
sinister. And it's really well done. So I appreciate that. But yeah, it's
Which I agree. I think that is like probably the top moment. It does kind of seem weird to like it peaked at the beginning of season 2, which I'm like, but that probably is like the best. Maybe not like the probably the best episode, because like even the episode itself really sets up like this, like, we're gonna get him, it's gonna plan. However, I will say, as great of a moment as that was, I do think, and this is in part why I think it going on as long as it did was a mistake. it kind of did shoot itself in the foot, where by losing Zoe, you did kind of lose probably the most like interesting character of the entire Tom Hammerschmidt, the boss of the paper where she worked. He was really cool. They developed him later. However, but then they're sort of like, who is the other two, Janice and Lucas? Like, they were like, okay, they're fine.
Lucas was so fucking weird. Like,
It was weird, and then like
he must be based on someone the writers didn't like or something, because like they
they like
humiliated that character.
they cucked
They
his
made
ass,
him
and
have
so
gay sex
that
with
was fun.
someone out of nowhere. Like, he's just
He
like,
gets like
"Oh, I'll help you, but you gotta like suck my like."
he gets raped. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, what the fuck are we
It's
doing here?
so we. I don't know what the. And I mean, I guess they were building up to him shooting Frank or whatever in season 4, but like, it was so weird what they do. He must be based on someone that like the writers didn't like or something, because they put this character through unusually like cruel writing.
Which is like and that's even like to consider, like to think that's even like more fucked up, where it's like, if that is the case, oh yeah, let's have an episode where he gets like sexually assaulted. It's like, yeah, y'all are fucked up, bro. um, yeah, it's like, so yeah, that was the thing. They kind of lost like um the more interesting characters. But then, like with Tom Hammerschmidt, he was a really cool character. But the issue is that I think at the end of season 4, they kind of bait that he's going to like finally catch on to them. And but of course, because the show has to keep going, he doesn't. It's a mistake. It fails. However, the issue is then it's like, okay, well, he's still in the show doing stuff, so it's like you're almost making him not like on purpose, but it almost makes him seem like the longer it goes on without them being able to like beat them, it almost makes them come off as more like incompetent or like silly. Where it's like it's like, oh no, he'll get him in season 8, and it's like, what the fuck? Like,
Yeah, and I don't want to attribute like this to the writers, like they were so smart that they could realize this, but like, I mean, there is something to this idea that like a president can just like not like can just ignore this like very damning story. Like, we've seen that happen more and more nowadays, especially. And again, I'm trying to avoid real world politics, but the show is so ingrained. It's really based off of a lot of real world politics. Now, I'm not saying the writers knew about all this stuff that would happen in the future. They're not that smart, but I mean, there is something to be said of like there is a controversy because of his news story that they were working on to take him down, but he found a way to just draw public attention to something else. And in this case, I think he starts a war with ISIS basically. And again, I'm not going to argue any real world people politics about any of this stuff, but like,
that
I
was
mean,
a
there is something to
very
be there. It is. It seems like it's some kind of commentary on like our short attention span in dealing with some of these issues.
well. That's what was weird. Um that thread in particular was strange. Where season 4 kind of ended with that, with like, now we're gonna see Frank and Claire like really take terrorism on like head on, and it's like okay, like I understand from like, again, if this was like a show that like was going to go on for 9 seasons, I understand like the thought process, like, oh, let's see what this story arc's gonna explore, sure. But then it's like, okay, but like the story itself, what the it's based on, the novel and the BBC miniseries, this is a story about a man's rise and fall. So it's kind of weird where like he rises and then he kind of like quivers back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and then and granted, like obviously, like he was, the show ended because Kevin Spacey got written off and he dies, which was stupid. But even so, it's like it's kind of weird that like his rise is until season 2, and then he just kind of does a bunch of stuff for like 3 seasons, and then he finally or 3 or 4 seasons, and then he falls in like what, season 6 or 7. It's like the pacing is just like wild. Like that seems like a wild, like I think season 2, like him becoming president, kind of serves as like almost like a good, if we sort of like go by the rules of like, Greek tragedy, it serves as like a good midpoint of the story. It's like, oh, the rise and now the fall. Hubris getting the best of him, but
Yeah, I mean, I think season 3, 4, and 5 were kind of meant to be them like struggling to hold on to power, but slowly being damaged. Like, you know, they cling to power a little bit, but they're losing allies. They're like, just like politicians do in real life or whatever. So, but yeah, I agree. Like, again, I don't, I kind of think that even if Kevin Spacey didn't like get canceled and written off the show, that it would not have stuck the landing, because I really don't know what they would have done.
Where
Like,
was it going at that
he
point?
lost. I mean,
Yeah.
okay, he loses the presidency at the end of season 5, right? Like, and Claire takes over as president. What happens now? Is she gonna go after him? Is he gonna go after her? Like, that almost feels like a midway point in and of itself. And maybe, I don't know, who knows? Maybe they would have done 8 or 9 more seasons and we would have explored that more. But it really felt like it was losing steam towards the end there, where they were kind of running out of ideas and just trying to be as shocking as possible to keep people interested, to keep them subscribed to Netflix.
And I guess you could say it's like, oh, it's like, well, his attempts to get Claire um, would eventually lead to his downfall. And it's like, okay, but then it's like, um, but then it's like, okay, but what about Claire? Like, if this is supposed to be like a morality tale about like his rise and fall due to hubris, it's like, what? But Claire gets off, and like, I guess, and like to its defense, I will say that I do think Claire was the more like a very I don't know if she had a counterpart um in the novel or BBC miniseries. Well, granted, sorry, obviously she probably has a counterpart, but I mean, like, I don't think they.
I
I
don't
don't
think
know
it's
if they.
about her like this
Yeah, they didn't
shows.
develop her as much as in the show. Where in the show, they really developed their because Robin Wright Penn was like excellent in the show, and her character really took off. So that's interesting. I'm glad that they kind of like followed that. But then, yeah, it's like have season 4 be the downfall. Have him going up against his worst enemy, Claire. Like that would have been awesome. But it just kept going, and you're like, okay, well,
Yeah, I don't. I mean, good that they developed her, but like, it's clear the show was not meant to be about her originally. And not to say that you can't pivot, but like, again, even if we ended with him, losing the presidency or whatever, what's Claire's story? What's her arc? Like, yeah, she just succeeds, and I guess you could argue that's the woke part of the show, right? It's a feminist kind of rise or whatever, but I honestly don't see it like that. I think the show is very like critical of politicians on both sides, that
oh
like
yeah,
feminism doesn't matter to Claire, like not really. Like, it's more about her, like her rise and her selfishness or whatever. Like, she's not an ally to women. Like, she screws over that girl who she used for her sexual assault bill to get herself more clout or whatever. Like not like for politicians, I think it was clear the show is like nothing matters. Like, values don't matter. It's about power, and it's about, doing what's best for themselves. And I think it was clear of that across party lines. It wasn't just the Democrats. It wasn't just the Republicans. It was all of them.
yeah. Well, that was kind of what was weird from what I remember of season 6. It was kind of like this weird um mix between like, it's sort of like, oh, it's because she's a female in power, she's still corrupt, but also it did kind of feel like they leaned into some feminist shit. I think, but at that point, like I don't think it even counts, because like they were like probably like, imagine that writer's room where they're like, guys, what the fuck, what do we do?
Yeah, we gotta like scramble to get something together,
Oh,
and
and the ending was like, it turned out that like fucking Doug killed. It was like, what? Like, what are we doing?
didn't she have like a satanic baby or something at the end? It was
What?
some really weird shit like at the
Oh,
end there.
I have to rewatch it
I
then.
don't
I
know.
don't.
She had like a baby, and she was like talking to it, and I don't know. There was some like satanic imagery or something, and
Oh
it's,
man, I gotta Google that shit. That
again,
sounds.
I don't know. It's just like, I mean, the show just went completely off the rails, and um, I think it was on that path long before the Kevin Spacey stuff. Again, arguably like Game of Thrones in a lot of ways. A declining quality for the last few seasons that just imploded at the end, because at the end you have to wrap stuff up. And if you've been wasting the last few seasons on like shitty writing, it's like there's not material there for you to really wrap up.
Yeah,
So I think it's, again, it came out around the same time as Game of Thrones did too. It was, they had a lot of overlap during that time period.
yeah. Looking back on it, it's like That's sort of like what's weird. It's like ironically the legacy of it is like, oh, because Kevin Spacey, and it's like, no, the show had a lot. And to your point, I think you're exactly right comparing it to Game of Thrones, where a lot of people will only focus on. Remember when it imploded? It's like, no, there was a lot of issues um under sort of bubbling under the surface, and they all kind of came to a head. Granted, like season 8 of Game of Thrones was like spectacularly bad. Like it was like almost like you'd think it was like on purpose, which no, it wasn't. But um yeah, spectacularly bad, like unbelievably just whoa. Yeah, House of Cards was even because yeah, like to your point, like I'm trying to think of, and I almost wonder maybe I could probably Google like what was the original plan for like were they going to end it with season 6 with Spacey's downfall? Is that how? What was the sort of idea going to be? But then, as you said, you've already kind of like shot yourself in the foot. Like I think, but again, I think the 4th season, like okay, so Claire leaves Frank. She partners with people to take him down. He does something crazy at the end of season 4, which leads to his reputation being tarnished, and that's the end. And then, granted, Claire, it's like, okay, well, what happens to her? It's like, well, we don't really need to know because it's more about him. Like that would, you're right. I do think that a lot of people would have been kind of like, well, I do wish we got more Claire, but at least that would sort of make sense. But like, yeah, going into it, it's like, okay, well, Claire's the president now or something. And then even if Kevin Spacey fails, okay, well, now she's still the president. So what message are you sending that like hubris is bad because Kevin Spacey, Frank, he fails, but Claire succeeds? Like it would have been really.
I saw that the showrunner left at the end of season 4, so the original showrunner of this of House of Cards. So
Oh, I
again,
think you're right. I do remember that.
you could see a natural kind of drop off as the vision changes right there too.
Yeah, and even the end of season 4, it was like, it was just so silly. It was like Claire leaves, and like it didn't even really even make any sense because it's like Claire is a character who was like super hard, like very like adamant, even almost more so than Frank. She was even more steel. So the idea that she would resolve to leave him at the end of season 3 and then and I think they even like fucked her character up in season 3. They made her like they tried because like in an attempt to sort of like I guess like flesh her out, they because like what was so cool about Claire in like season 1 and 2 was she almost was sort of like a not necessarily a Lady Macbeth kind of character, but she was very like she was steel. She was almost like pushing him. And then for season 3, she kind of became. There were moments in season 1 and 2 where it did kind of show her softer side, her compassion. Um, but the pacing was just like even her leaving Frank. Like I get it, like from a narrative standpoint, did they really sell it? Probably not. But it's like okay, I'll buy it. But then you have them get back together at the end of season 4, and then at the end of season 5, they're at war again. It's like, what are we doing? Like,
She comes across very wishy-washy, especially towards the end. It's like, oh yeah, she's the hard one who has like no emotions, but she's also the one who's like sensitive and cares about these like political issues. But no, she's also willing to screw people over for this, but she feels bad about them and she blames like Frank. It's like she comes across very wishy-washy, and I get what they're trying to do because like you can have a character who's contradictory, right? But a lot of times it doesn't feel like cohesive. It feels like just too they want the character to kind of essentially be both, and it doesn't really work. Like it's hard to pull that off. It's very rare that you have like a really successful character that's like goes back and forth between those two extremes.
what? And you know what? I think, and to like the point we're talking about, I think that's okay, but it has to, because again, it kind of goes back to like the newsroom thing, where it's like it's okay to see the newsroom people like, um, it like if we look at like The Wire, like the cops make progress and then they have setbacks and progress and setbacks and progress and setbacks, but there's always this feeling that like they're getting somewhere, like they're building to it. So like her wishy-washiness was fine, but by the end of season 3 when she left Frank, that was kind of the point where it's like, okay, she's made her decision now, like she's the wishy-washiness should be over, like she's like she's done. She's picked her path. But then it's like, no, actually, she goes back on it. But then later, actually, so like when you have a wishy-washy character and then you have to spread that out over like 2 or 3 seasons, it ends up almost making them seem it just like they're just stupid, or like they're not even a character anymore. They're just like, yeah,
Well, her whole thing was like she wanted power for herself, not just as Frank's wife, but like her own power. Which, again, that could be an interesting arc, but it just gets muddled with this whole thing of like she actually cares about some of these issues she's talking about, but also not really. Um,
yeah,
the only character who I felt like their wishy washiness is like really well done and works for her character was Carmela Soprano. Like I felt like that character just owned like it made sense. She was always kind of being wishy washy about like she supports Tony, but she also doesn't like it. She loves Tony, but she also hates him. She
yeah.
wants to be an independent woman, but she also doesn't. Like, I felt like that really worked for her. Like, that was her thing. She was a contradiction like that. And that
But
made sense to
then
me.
But then to your point, it's like that is true. But then as it goes on, when we get to season 4, that's like the climax. That's when she makes everything, all the wishy washiness between season 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 throughout it builds up, and then it finally explodes in her final decision, which is when she leaves Tony.
But she
Um,
gets back together with Tony, and that's again like part of her thing. Like she compromises her values or whatever because she wants something out of it.
but I think the key is like that was like the moment of decision. But then the show is about like backsliding. So throughout season 5, she gets back together, and then throughout season 6, she like backslides into. By the end of the show, she's like basically reverted to like her Jersey housewife, not pushing back at all against Tony.
And that's why it
Um,
works for her character. Whereas for
yes,
for House of Cards, it's like she's not backsliding into being Frank's wife again. She's just like she's
yes.
on an arc that just is not really going anywhere. Doesn't have the time to really go anywhere because again they're just kind of making this shit up as it goes because Kevin Spacey got written out.
Yeah, because like a comparable thing would be like you have Carmela break up with Tony in season 4, get back together with him in season 5, and then in season 6, for some reason, she decides to leave him again. That's like it would be like, wait a minute, what? What's going on? It's like if you want to commit to that, like she like kind of has her epiphany moment, but then she slowly gets sucked back in. That's great, but commit to it. Don't like pussy out. Yeah,
Yeah, it's definitely you have to really be intentional about if your character is being wishy-washy like that, and a lot of the Sopranos characters were like that. The show, you're right, the show is very much about like backsliding into old habits. The Wire touches on that too to an extent. But yeah, this show, I mean, those shows are also, I'd argue, more character driven than this show too. This is a very plot driven show, very much about like what's the next plan, what's the next like step in the master plan here, and when the master plan turns out to be kind of stupid at the end, it's like, what's the point?
or then it's like, by the problem was is like I think season 1 succeeded to some extent because, well, it's interesting, they don't actually show you, they don't tell you in season 1 what his plan is until like episode like 10 or 11, like very late in the season, that he's scheming for vice president. Funny enough, it is funny. I can't wait to rewatch House of Cards eventually because if I'm not mistaken, there are like a couple threads, at least in the pilot, that go absolutely nowhere. I think there was one, and correct me if I'm wrong. There was a scene in the pilot where Doug meets the police commissioner or like the police chief or something in like a diner. And I remember thinking, it's like, okay, that's going to be part of it. And it goes nowhere. I don't think it ever comes up again. And it's like, that's kind of funny. Like, it's just,
I remember
um,
that too. I don't remember the context of what they were talking about or whatever. Yeah, it doesn't go
well,
anywhere.
there was no context because it was like just a setup. It almost felt like the writer was like, oh, this will pay off. I don't know how, but it will pay off. And then they decided against it later down the line.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of like weird like character sex stuff that like it's trying to establish character, but I don't know if it really pays off in a meaningful way. Like the whole prostitute that Doug's like obsessed with.
That was
Like
so.
I get what it's saying. I get that he's like a creepy weirdo, and that's part of his character. But like
But this is like,
she like it doesn't really treat her like a character. Like yeah, she's got this kind of like lesbian romance with this other character, but it doesn't feel like this. They're genuinely writing her. It feels like they're setting her up to be killed by Doug because we want to
she,
establish that Doug's a weirdo.
she's like absent. Well, season 2 is interesting at the end when she like hits him over the head, and then we think he's dead, but then he's not. But then she runs, but then she's absent all of season 3 except in the finale, and then Doug kills her, and it's like, okay, whoa, that's a little weird.
Yeah, it's
Um,
what do we? It's just I don't know. If we want to just show Doug's creepy weirdo, we can do it. But like you've written this character here that you're not actually really writing. She's just like almost like a prop
and
for the sex storyline you want to do.
and to your point, the show is about like political intrigue. So like I actually think like Doug in and of himself, I think is an interesting character. Like his like fanatical devotion to Frank, like the point where he'll do like horrible crimes. Um, that's interesting enough. Why do we have this subplot with him and Rachel, and which has nothing really to do with like political intrigue, unless at the end of season 2, when she hits him over the head and escapes, if she hooked up with like the reporters, like, okay, she's going to work with them to take Frank down. That's fine. But it's like, no, we're just going to have her run away and then get murdered. And it's like,
Well, I think they wanted
okay.
to show that like there's like again a bunch of weird sex stuff happening at the top level of politics.
Yeah. Which is like, it's like, oh, cool. But like, we got that. And then you kept doing it over and over and
Yeah, I
over.
mean
It's like,
Frank has bisexual sex with like a whole bunch of like weird sex with a whole bunch of characters. Like I don't know if we need this subplot here.
or not.
Uh,
Or not even that, but it was like he and like Claire have like a threesome with like their security guard, and then
they did. They had a relationship. Frank
Claire
had
fucked the
sex with
biographer or something.
yeah. Frank had sex with some other guys in the White House. It's like there's a whole bunch of sex stuff going on already. Like we don't need this other little subplot here. There's a whole thing with the military woman who was like who was going to be his vice president. That I was
Oh
just
yeah,
like,
she was a cool character, but then there
she
was
was
a
all
whole.
right. She was all. I don't know. I just like I don't.
Well, I think it was she was interesting, like setting up, but then like to your point,
I
she
don't
just
think it
kind of
pays
like
off. Yeah.
she just spun her wheels for 3 seasons.
There's
Like
that.
okay,
There's that. Like the guy who represents the companies. That
oh
he's.
Mahershala Ali, like
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Exactly.
but then
Yeah.
they have an affair, and you're like,
He's
what's
an
going on?
affair, and it's like I don't know. I don't know if this is really building up to like a character moment here. It just feels like we got these characters here. Let's have them fuck. Like
It felt very much like for a show that was supposedly about like scheming and like very plot driven, it did reach a point where I was like, there's so much soap opera shit in this. Which and to be fair, like at the end of the day, it is kind of a soap opera, but season 1 was, and I mean, granted, I think season 1 was kind of padded. Like that could have been a lot shorter. It really fucking drew, like, you know, drew things out in part, and the reason it worked is because we don't know what Frank is up to. But then after you're like, okay, um, they really drawn things were really drawn out. So obviously, I understand you have to fill the airtime with stuff, but and that is to kind of go back to like the whole precursor thing. Each season was 13 episodes, whereas I think it was. I don't want to say it's for sure because that's kind of like the standard for most shows at the time. But because it was streaming, that after that, people kind of realized, oh, we don't have to do that. We can make an 8-episode show. Not to say there weren't shows like that from then on there, but I think it became a lot more, particularly after True Detective. I think that was when we started seeing it. Oh, like 6-episode series, 8-episode, 10, not 13, which is kind of a weird number when you think about it.
yeah, I mean Sopranos did 13. I think a lot of shows are copying off of that, but I will say though, I really don't like this less and less episodes per season thing. Like
Yeah, you were saying
I don't
that.
want
Yeah.
padding, but like I've seen some like shows coming out that are like the next season's like 6 episodes, and I'm like, what the 6 episodes is not a fucking season. That's a mini series. Like what the absolute? I swear to God, we're gonna get like 4-episode seasons coming up here, and each episode will be an hour and 30 minutes. So it's like you're getting 8 episodes, and it's like no, It completely throws off the pacing, and I want a full goddamn season of content here. I don't want it padded. Write a story that occupies 13 episodes or whatever. Write it well and put in interesting stuff where I want to watch. But like, yeah, this is real shrinkflation happening with television shows nowadays.
Yeah, well, it sucks because it's like, on one hand, there's sort of like, there's got to be like a middle ground where it's like, so like for Barry, 4 seasons, 8 episodes per season, half an hour episodes, so 16 hours total, which is only a little bit more than like 1.5 regular seasons of like a premium channel show. However, it works well for the structure of the show. It suits it well. What I really bugs me is when you'll see shows that don't, like, it'll be like 10 episodes one season, but then 15 the next, or like, and then 8. And it's like, okay, we're kind of like fucking with like, I have no problem with like different episode lengths for seasons of shows, but now you're fucking with them in the same show, which feels really weird. Even I don't fully agree with this. I think we talked about it where I'm generally okay with like different episode lengths. So for example, the example I used was Bear season 2. Most of the episodes were like 30, 35 minutes, but then there was one that was like an hour long. However, it makes sense why that one episode is longer. So that's fine. But then if you're watching a show, I mean, like Stranger Things, we talked about that. That was egregious. Where like one was like 2.5 hours. That was stupid. Um, but then there is something to be said. It's like, okay, if all these episodes are like wildly different, what is like, you're almost like losing the structure of the show. You're kind of throwing off the pacing of the structure that you're sticking to in the show, which I imagine also leads to like weird shit going on.
I think there's a natural rhythm to how you write shows based on the limitations of television. Like again, people used to talk about that with network television with ad breaks. Like you had to kind of write shows with this idea in mind, and HBO really upended that with the fact that there are no commercials, so they didn't have to write like, oh, a cliffhanger at at the 1/3 mark to get you over the commercial break or whatever. So I'm glad they've gotten rid of some stuff like that, but I do wonder if those long episodes in particular, like they work for some shows or whatever, but I think a lot of times when I see them, the pacing is just really off because they're so used to writing in like one one style of format that when you
Mhm.
give them all the time in the world, that episode just feels like a lot of finales feel that way, feel really off to me in terms of pacing because of the length.
Absolutely.
Some of them do it well, but even like the Wire's finale, I was like going when I rewatched that, I'm like the ending, the last little bit is really good, but you forget how much they stuff into that last episode. They go from not knowing who the serial killer is to solving the entire case
Yeah,
within like
that
20
was.
minutes, and it's you can tell it's like really off, and it's again I think that one's like an hour and a half long.
It really, to be honest, it's like the first hour is really like the episode, and then the last half hour is like kind of like an epilogue in a way, which is fine, but it does kind of feel weird. But then to counter that, well, no, not really to counter it. Final Grades, which was the season 4 finale, was like 77 minutes long, but that was fine. That was like it. That was an example of like, you guys had a lot of characters, a lot of threads. It makes extra, but it didn't feel that way when you're watching it. It just feels like, yeah,
Going 17 minutes over is like not that big a deal.
yeah. The Sopranos, I actually think the season 4 finale was the longest episode. I think it was like 70 something minutes. But the finale, the series finale, I think was regular. Maybe it was like 5 minutes longer. No, it was 60 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, and Whitecaps too. Like, not to talk trash about that episode. I mean, that's an S tier episode for me. But when I rewatched it, I was like, oh yeah, this does feel a little bit longer. Now they put a lot of great stuff in there, so it works. But even still, it's like you forget how fast they like, or how wide that episode covers. Of like, they're together and happy at the beginning of the episode, and he's leaving the house by the end, and it works, but like it does feel like it goes on a little bit. Like you can tell like there's I almost wonder if maybe the fight and stuff been should have happened last episode, and we could have dealt with the fallout a little bit in that final one.
Yeah. Or well, it's funny too because like Sopranos is an example of a show where when we're to your point about pacing, Sopranos is a show where like the climax of the episode would happen roughly like halfway through. So like the first, so for example, if we take, I'm trying to think of like a good example. Oh, perfect. Like say take like the season 3 finale when Jackie Jr. gets killed. That happens halfway through. And then the last half hour is sort of like the wrap up of like what it means for everybody. And so the show that was kind of like so the show each hour was kind of like sort of like it was almost like a self-contained story into itself, whereas something Mad Men was the same way. Whereas something like Breaking Bad was like every episode ended on like a huge cliffhanger, and it works for that show. However, like now that's sort of like why when I rewatch Breaking Bad, like I can't really like throw on an episode of Breaking Bad because it all kind of similar to like The Wire. It's like more of like a very hyper serialized where it's like this is
You
a
have to
single
start
story.
at least at the first episode of a season. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
really hard to jump in the middle.
yeah. So to your point, once you start like fucking with, and each show kind of finds their own rhythm. So once you start fucking with it, oh, what was it? Wasn't like the Office series finale like super long? It's like an hour.
Well, yeah, but The Office also like really kind of shit the bed the last two
Yeah.
seasons. So
And
they had
also it was kind of like it was 52 minutes, so twice as long as like even a double episode. And it was kind of hokey. It was like, oh, everyone has their I mean, like, I guess it was like a comedy, so it's like, well, everyone like has to have their little moment and cute little thing, which is I guess, but
yeah, I really like. I mean, they really just should not have kept going after Steve Carell left. Like,
no.
there was just nowhere for the show to go. Like they even have this moment where they introduce these two like intern characters, and they even joke in the context of the documentary itself, being like, "Oh yeah, I was only in the last 5 minutes of the documentary." It's like, yeah, like why are you introducing characters in the last like little bit here that really just don't have like no one cares about these little interns that they introduced or whatever, because we're at the end here and we're trying to like celebrate and remember like Jim and Pam and all the characters we grew to love, and it's like, oh yeah, here are the two new characters that we introduced.
Yeah, and it's like, and again, I understand like from their perspective, it's like, well, we want to, it's a popular show, want to keep it going, but it's like, yeah, but like, to what, it, how, at what point do you say the alternative is running the show into the ground, and then the legacy of the show is compromised? Um, yeah, I don't know. It's there's a balance there, I guess, but
Yeah, yes. I mean, they're probably dabbing their eyes with all their $100 bills or whatever, and
yeah, they don't. Well, I mean, I'm like not to like put them. Granted, I think that is like a big. The bottom line obviously matters a lot. But even so, I think that there are like people in the industry who are like creatively minded and like do want to. But what I mean is like even from a like a business decision, like take Dexter. Um, you know, you know, when that show went on for 8 seasons and like the ending was like so bad that it kind of like ruined like the show basically when so from that I was like, okay, like yeah, you ran it out into the ground, you got your money, but now that property is just dead. So now when I think New Blood, the new Dexter came out, remember like the other season or something, like no one was really excited for it because it was like, why am I excited for this show? It's a continuation. Same thing with Game of Thrones. Oh, great. You ran it out as much as you want. You got what you wanted, but now no one gives a shit about your spinoffs. Although House
I
of
don't know. I think I think HBO is still like really interested because they also greenlit a whole new side project. Actually, multiple. So we're gonna get to Dunkin' Egg. That's guaranteed.
oh really? I thought didn't like a bunch of them get canceled, or
No,
maybe they're
no, no.
bringing them back.
Dunkin' Egg is filming next year. I think it's gonna be out, or I think it's filming this year. It's gonna be out next year.
Oh
At
wow.
least the first one. I really don't like that they're doing it at like each book a whole season because there's not enough content in the Dunk and Egg books to be a full season.
Yeah, well, that's going back to what we were
They
talking
should
about
do a
like,
mini. They should have done it like a mini series, like, or a little like movies where it's like each
yeah,
book is like one episode, which would work perfectly. But I don't know. We'll see. But they also, I think I think they greenlit a Nymeria, like the Dornish area. They greenlit a series about her 10,000 ships. Yeah,
it's
10,000. It's called
okay.
10,000 ships. It's a prequel about Nymeria. They're obviously playing on the feminist angle, and like not no conspiracy. Like it's she's a very famous feminist character, even in the world of Game of Thrones. Like Arya's like Arya's like idolizes her.
Yeah,
That's
but I don't
why
know.
she named her dog.
I don't know if it's like the feminist angle though. It's like because like even like House of Dragon, it's like the show's if it was like a show that was like didn't already have like really strong female characters, I could see that. But I think the show already has like a good track record of like strong female characters.
No, but I'm saying that like why did they choose this story to tell? It's like obviously they're looking for strong female characters to center their show
Yeah,
on.
I don't know. But then you could ask, it's like okay, but why they do a Dunk and Egg?
Well, because that's the only other book series that is doing it.
But that's what I mean. Where it's like I don't know. It seems like I just don't like that attitude where it's like oh, well, they're doing this because it's like, well, maybe they just read it and they thought it was cool. I don't know. It seems like there's always sort of like this ulterior intention put on. It's like, oh, hey, this story of this character is pretty based. We should make a show on it. And it's like there's almost like this interior. It's like, oh, well, now they're using it for like brownie points. It's like, well, maybe, but maybe they're just doing it because it looks based. Like that's, I mean, like that's kind of that's kind of how House of the Dragon is, where it's like, well, to be fair, that I think that was because a lot of people don't like. I think when House of Dragon, for people who weren't familiar with the lore, I think that they saw it and they were like, I think there was some rumblings of like, oh, you're trying to like these female characters now. It's like, but people who know the lore, it's like, no, that's not how. That's not. It just isn't like a girl boss sort of thing, bro. This is gonna get fucking fucked up pretty quickly.
I don't know about that. I think they are going to make it. The new episode actually comes out tonight. I haven't seen it because we had to record this podcast, but I'm gonna watch it later tonight. I'm not saying it's wrong. Like I don't like. I think it's fine to want to make more feminist stuff or whatever, but that is absolutely part of the intention. I think they do want to play up the girl boss angle of this show, and I think they're going to whitewash Rhaenyra a lot. I don't think she's going to be nearly as horrible as she is in the books because her side is the quote unquote good side in the show.
Well, I think that's the thing though. It's like I don't think that's an issue of like girl boss shit. I think that's an issue of sort of like the Hollywoodization of the story, which is what we saw in the show with like Jon Snow and Dany. It's like by season, and to your point, where sort of the show went off base is when it really started to be clear. Because again, the whole show is built on this idea of like there are no good guys and bad guys. But by season 6, it's like, no, there are good guys and bad guys. Like it's very, very clear which characters are the good guys and which ones are the bad guys. So I think that's the issue where it's like the story of like between Rhaenyra and it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be like a good guys bad guys. It's supposed to be like political intrigue and everyone's fucked up, but they kind of can't help Hollywoodize it where oh people like her more, so we should kind of lean into it. But
I don't know, man. I don't know why you kind of though are like you kind of refuse to acknowledge like the pro feminist, pro woke stuff that Hollywood wants to do. And I'm not saying that stuff is inherently bad, but it absolutely is there. Like they talked about how they wrote the I'm blanking on her name, the queen, the one who was married to her dad. They wrote her to be like a females for Trump type character. Like they wanted to play up like her internalized like misogyny or whatever stuff they wanted to write. And again, I'm not saying that's bad that they want to write a show like that. I really do like House of the
yeah,
Dragon.
but that was already present in the source. That's the whole
No,
like
not
with
not. I don't think
yeah, with
so.
her character, yeah.
No, I
Because like
don't.
that was her whole
I don't think the issue was feminism as it was there, but it wasn't as much as this show makes feminism the central issue. The reason why they didn't accept Rhaenyra as their queen was not just because she's a woman and a woman will never sit on the Iron Throne. It's like there were a lot of other stuff that I think the show glosses over, partially for just simplification purposes, like you talked about. Yes, that's part of it. They're trying to just
yeah.
tell a simpler story. But I think they also want to play up the girl boss angle, which I
Uh,
don't think is a bad thing. Like I think
no,
that's fine.
I'm not saying that like there's no girl boss shit at all. The issue is like it gets to a point where it's like there's almost sort of like people speak of it as if it's like so for example where it's like to your point the Nymeria thing where it's like oh that'd be cool like this is a pretty kick-ass story of this badass bitch we should like do the story that sounds cool but then when people sort of like talk about it it almost sounds like there's sort of like this like well you're doing this for the it's almost as if like whereas again if it's like if I wrote a story of like wow this badass character is like this badass male character is like super badass let's write it there isn't this sort of like ulterior motive being spoken about it seems like whenever there's sort of like a female centric or like a POC centric story there's always this sort of like I'm trying to think of a good word there's like this like shadow of like suspicion cast over it where it's like are they gonna and not only that but then every decision like to your point, like when you were talking about, oh, we're playing up the girl boss stuff. I don't really think it was that. I think it was more that we're trying to fit. Well, not only that, because like there wasn't as much, there wasn't like tons of lore. There, like George R. R. Martin kind of wrote the broad strokes in the book. Um, we have to sort of we have to make it clear, but at the same time, we have to streamline it and make it kind of like straight to the point which was I especially considering season one had to deal with like because it really was I would say like almost like two seasons since the first half was like them younger and that whole arc and then the second half of the season was her grown and fleshing that out but even so like even with Renette like there's plenty like we understand especially I'm sorry, I'm blanking. Is it Millicent? Who's the not Renner? Millicent's Elden Ring. I need to rewatch it. Hang on. You can cut this
Oh,
part out.
Allison, that's the
Allison.
girl.
Sorry,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
goes close. It was close. Even Allison, and that's sort of why I will agree with you. I think the issue is that people like on Twitter and shit like that, social media, they really pick sides. But even so, I think the show does a really good job of like I understand why Allison is pissed. I don't agree with her. I think it's petty, but I 100% understand. I've like done everything by the book. I did everything I was supposed to. There's honor, there's tradition, yada yada yada, and you just come in and barge down the walls and think it's bullshit, and that's bullshit. Yeah.
I think we're agreeing in the sense that I think the show like to me that like it is very clear that Hollywood is pushing like more women, more POCs in media. I don't necessarily think that makes a show bad or not. Like I said, I think House of Dragon's great. I really do like that first season. But it's clear to me that like yes, there is like a desire to write more strong female characters. Yes, there is a desire to show more, black people in Game of Thrones, which is why the Valerians are black. That wasn't just a random casting choice. They want that, and I don't think it hurts the show at all. I think it's completely fine.
Well, I
But
think
like that desire to push that absolutely exists. I just don't think it's inherently bad. It could be bad if you write it badly,
well, I
but to
think
me,
that's
having those characters there doesn't hurt it.
but I think that's the issue. That's sort of like where like the conversation shifts where it's like yeah, no, there are push like people are. It's like, hey, we should like try these female characters. Why not? Let's do these POC characters. But there seems to be this push where there's sort of like this air of suspicion on well if you do that you're almost like there's like this idea that it like well now you're compromising the creative process
Yeah, I
which
don't
is
agree with that,
which
but you
is
were kind of
yeah
saying though like it doesn't exist. You're like, I don't think that even
no I'm
factored into their
saying
mind.
I'm saying like what I'm talking about is like the more like because again it's like obviously, if you have a more like diverse writers room, obviously you're going to lead to more diverse stories, plot lines, etc. What I mean is like this sort of like the quote unquote, because this is like where we get into the weeds where we're talking about like, well, what's the agenda? And it's like, well, agenda kind of has, in general, I think it sort of has this sort of like negative connotation to it. It has like, there's almost like, oh, again, it's like they're framing it, or most people who complain about it frame it as if it's like, because you're pushing the agenda, you're compromising creativity, which I think which doesn't make any sense. I think that's like anti-creativity. Almost most creative works have an agenda, like like what. But the issue I have is like when other people talk about like agenda, there's almost like this sort of like, haha, we're going to like, there's sort of like this like negative undercurrent. That's sort of what I'm getting
Yeah,
at.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be negative. And like I said, like the first season worked really well. I think it's fine. But yes, I do think there is a push in Hollywood to. You can call it an agenda. You can call it righting the wrongs. You can call it whatever you want. But there is absolutely a push to have more women and minorities in this stuff, which is not inherently bad. Like you can bad writing is bad, right? If a show can have all these characters and be good or bad just depending on the writing regardless. So
Or I think, or to your point, I think the other, or the term you use, I don't know if you use it in this sense, but I think like, so for example, like when people talk about like, if you and I were talking about, hey, let's like, look at like really cool female characters in the lore and explore their stories. That when people use the term, and I'm not saying you're using it like this, but when people often use the term girl boss, they're not just talking about a certain classification of a character, they're talking about a certain trend of, or I guess perceived trend, where not only are we centering female stories, we're then sanitizing them and making them like perfect angels who do no wrong and like who crush the men. Like that does happen, but I think it's like way, going back to your point about like the shows where, oh, when the women do it, I think it does happen in some shows, but it seems like, or if you would ask like the, like, sort of like your average like chud, it's like it's all over and there's every show. But then like you actually ask them and you're like, well, which ones? And it's like they either like name shows from like, what about this one episode of this Netflix show from like 10 years ago? Or like they're like, you get like Skylar White syndrome, where you're like, it's almost like a weirdly delusional. I saw that with like, you'll get that with like Shiv Roy in Succession. You'll get that with even Carmela Soprano and Sopranos. I'm doing Barry, the show I'm doing next one. The character of Sally is like, it's like Skylar 2.0. Like some of the fandom are like fucking psychos. Yeah. So just to make clear, I agree with you. It's like there is a push to like center these stories. It just seems like when people sort of, there's always sort of like this implication that there's like, by doing so you're compromising creativity, which I don't think that tracks.
yeah, it can be, but it's not inherent. Like you can have, this representation and it can still be great writing regardless. Which I think is the main point. So I'm looking forward to watching the first episode of season 2 after this podcast is over, and we can
I
talk about
completely
how.
forgot. You remind me. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
it came out today. So maybe next time, not next time. Next time we're doing our episode 50.
Yes.
We're gonna do something special. We're gonna attempt to live stream it. I'm not sure how that's gonna go. I've been looking at how we actually like live stream two of us together. We might need to talk after this and figure out
We'll
how we're
figure
gonna
it
make it
out.
work.
I think probably we can do like a meeting later in the week. I think you should just be able to like, one of us. Well, if we both live stream, like we might have to use a different platform, but maybe like Discord or something. But if we both stream, like live stream our screens, that should be fine because we'd be streaming the same thing.
Yeah, I thought. I mean, we could talk about this after the
Yeah, we'll
episode,
have
but
to.
we're gonna do a live episode of No One's a Critic for our 50th episode special. We've been We're 50 episodes into this so far, which is really cool. And then maybe the next episode of that we can talk about House of the Dragon. So season 2.
I might need a refresher, but yes.
Well, cool. Thank you all for listening to this, and stay tuned for the next episode coming soon.
Take care, y'all.